This is the Tombigbee Tales, and I'm your host, Shannon Evans. I write about a small town in northeast Mississippi on the Tombigbee River called Columbus, and sometimes I write about the rest of the state. This episode is entitled A Dark Chapter in Columbus's History, the Era of Lynching. Columbus and Lowndes County was never destroyed during the Civil War thanks to Thomas Blewett convincing General Stephen D. Lee that the Black Belt Prairie was the most logical breadbasket for forging a new nation after they won. General Lee, originally from South Carolina and married to a Columbus Society doyenne, Regina Harrison, was a staunch secessionist, pro-slavery war hawk who ordered the firing of the first shot on Fort Sumter to start the Civil War. After the war, Lee returned to his new home in Columbus and began to rebuild his life. He continued to be a staunch segregationist and fought the local Reconstruction provost at every turn for implementing structures that not only educated the former enslaved people, but also the organizations that came to teach and to help them register to vote. He was active in local and state politics and helped shape post-war education policies in Mississippi. He promoted lost cause mythology by becoming the chairman of the historical committee of the United Confederate Veterans Association, thus ensuring lost cause ideology would be taught in all Southern schools. He was especially active in formalizing Lowndes County school policies to permanently and proactively exclude blacks from white schools. He also ensured that any public funding provided to Union Academy, the first black school in Lowndes County, would be minimal. The janitor at Franklin Academy, the first public school for white children in Columbus, was paid more than any of the black teachers at Union Academy. Lee was openly racist and in a June 15, 1889 speech at the Lowndes County Courthouse declared, quote, "The question of white supremacy is no issue. That battle has been fought some time ago and won, that the white people should rule, not this state alone, but the whole South." End quote. It should come as no surprise that the influence of his white supremacist ideology permeated the South, but especially Lowndes County. These ideologies festered under the yoke of Reconstruction and began to bubble to the surface before the carpetbaggers and occupational forces even left the state. As a senator in the Mississippi legislature, Lee, fearing the U.S. Congress was going to give black citizens the right to vote, admitted, quote, "Let us not fool ourselves. We know that the Negro appreciates and is proud of his right to vote. He will undertake more trouble and go further to exercise this privilege than the white man." End quote. To counteract the black vote, Lee advocated for white women's suffrage so they could outnumber and thus outvote the black citizen voters in the South. While lynching of black men and women had occurred in the South prior to the Civil War, it had been mostly a rarity. Enslaved people were far too valuable. After the end of the cross-Atlantic import of enslaved people, those here became precious commodities that could be worked or rented out to work for someone else. In the decades following the American Civil War, a disturbing phenomenon in the American War, the Deep South, the practice of lynching. This extrajudicial killing of individuals, predominantly African Americans, served as a brutal method of racial control and intimidation. Our narrative explores this dark chapter in Southern history, examining its causes, patterns, and lasting impact on American society. As the dust settled from the Civil War, the South found itself in economic and social turmoil. Once wealthy plantations lay in ruins, and the social order that upheld slavery was shattered. Many white Southerners, resentful of their defeat and the changes brought by Reconstruction, sought to reassert their dominance over the newly freed black population. The passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, which abolished slavery, granted citizenship to former enslaved people, and gave black men the right to vote, further intensified white resistance. This is the period that saw the rise of organizations like the Ku Klux Klan, which used violence and intimidation to suppress black political and social advancement. Mississippi, once the wealthiest state per white capita, plunged into poverty. Competition for limited resources, absentee land ownership, and resistance to industrial and agricultural mechanization all contributed to escalating racial tensions. As one contemporary letter from A.E. Perkins to the governor of Mississippi in 1892 illustrates, quote, "There has been a general disturbance among colored people. They jolted and jarred from center to circumference. At night, he is warned and threatened that he leave a certain place by certain times." End quote. The economic system of sharecropping, which replaced slavery, kept many black farmers in a cycle of debt and poverty. This system, combined with discriminatory laws known as black codes and later Jim Crow laws, created a new form of racial subjugation. Lynchings emerged as a horrific means of maintaining white supremacy. Between 1882 and 1910, hundreds of black men, women, and even children fell victim to mob violence. These public killings sent a chilling message. Any perceived transgression against the racial order could result in a swift and violent death. One of the most infamous cases, of course, that we all know about was the lynching of Emmett Till in 1955. Till, a 14-year-old from Chicago, was brutally murdered while visiting relatives in Mississippi after allegedly wolf whistling at a white woman. His killers were acquitted by an all-white jury despite later admitting to the crime. While lynchings were often justified as protection against black men assaulting white women, the reality was far different. Of the 925 lynching events of blacks between 1882 and 1910, for which offenses are known, 40% were allegedly for rape or attempted rape. 29% were for alleged murders. 32% were for other offenses, including minor infractions or simply racial causes. In many cases, accusations of rape or assault were fabricated or greatly exaggerated. For example, in 1906, Ed Johnson was lynched in Chattanooga, Tennessee, after being accused of rape. The Supreme Court posthumously overturned his conviction in 2021. Contrary to popular belief, lynching was not uniformly practiced across the Deep South. Between 1882 and 1990, 25% of Deep South counties lynched no blacks. 22% had only one lynching event. However, some areas became notorious for their high rates of lynching, particularly in the Delta and the Black Belt Prairie region. For instance, Lowndes County, Mississippi, saw 16 recorded lynchings between 1877 and 1950, earning it the grim nickname Bloody Lowndes. July emerged as the most common month for lynchings in the South, a pattern that held true even in specific counties like Lowndes County. This trend may be attributed to several factors: increased social interactions during the summer months, higher temperatures potentially exacerbating tensions, and agricultural cycles affecting economic pressures. It's kind of crucial to note that while the vast majority of lynching victims were black, the practice wasn't exclusively a white-on-black phenomenon. The record shows 45 cases where lynch mobs were believed or known to be all black or racially integrated. We had several of those here in Lowndes County. At least 2 cases where black mobs lynched white victims. This complexity challenges simplistic narratives about lynching and highlights the need for a nuanced understanding of this dark period. For example, in 1911, in Okemah, Oklahoma, or is it Okemah, Oklahoma, a black mob lynched a white man named Ira Johnson for allegedly murdering a black man. This rare incidence of a black-on-white lynching demonstrates the complex racial dynamics of the era. The era of lynching cast a long shadow over American society, reinforcing racial hierarchies and instilling generational trauma in African American communities. Its effects lingered long after the practice declined, shaping the civil rights movement and continuing to influence race relations in the United States today. The threat of lynching was a significant factor in the Great Migration, which saw millions of African Americans move from to urban areas in the North and West between 1916 and 1970. This massive demographic shift reshaped American cities and culture. The brutality of lynchings galvanized civil rights activists. The 1955 lynching of Emmett Till, mentioned earlier, became a catalyst for the civil rights movement. Till's mother, Mamie Till Mobley, insisted on an open casket funeral to show the world the horrific violence inflicted on her son, sparking outrage and mobilizing activists. The fight against lynching led to significant legal reforms. The NAACP, founded in 1909, made anti-lynching legislation a priority. Although federal anti-lynching legislation was not passed until 2022, these efforts contributed to broader civil rights protections. In popular culture, works like Billie Holiday's song Strange Fruit and Harper Lee's novel To Kill a Mockingbird brought the horrors of lynching to wider audiences, shaping public perceptions and contributing to challenging attitudes about racial violence. As we reflect on this painful chapter of history, we have to be reminded of the importance of confronting our past, understanding its complexities, and working towards a more just and equitable society for all. In November 1871, Klan intimidation had reached a boiling point in the South, and congressional investigators came to Columbus, led by General Blair, to examine the condition of affairs in southern states. The Ku Klux Klan Act, H.R. 320, had been enacted in April of 1871, outlawing intimidation and giving President Grant the ability to declare martial law. Columbus resident and a former state senator, Robert Gleed's testimony before congressional investigators included a lengthy discussion on whippings. He also discussed the whippings of black teachers and the murder of black men on both the Halbert and Durden plantations. According to Gleed, the Klan sought to disenfranchise black Republicans, which outnumbered white voters in Lowndes County. Then, in December 1874, Lowndes County Democrats were concerned about the upcoming elections and formed the White Liners to further intimidate black voters. The Weekly Mississippi Pilot reported on June 26, 1875, the circulation of handbills which threatened the jobs and access to medical treatment of anyone who voted Republican. The White Liners did not limit their activities to Lowndes County, and the Mississippi Plan of Democratic Redemption was in full swing across the state. In Vicksburg, Democrats demanded the resignation of the town's black sheriff, Peter Crosby, and went on to kill him and over 300 blacks in the surrounding county. In September 1875, the White Liners killed at least 50 blacks in Hinds County and murdered a white teacher who taught in black schools. In late October 1875, the Klan descended on the Dover community in Yazoo County, and 2 white teachers were killed because they dared to vote Republican. It was in this environment of fear and intimidation that the perfect storm was brewing for the Lowndes County Sheriff's election of 1875. Local papers ran circulars on the candidates titled "Stand to Your Colors" that listed those who were worthy, local Southern, and unworthy, carpetbaggers from the North, and African American men, as candidates. Local Democrats held meetings all over the county daily for 2 weeks prior to Election Day. Each meeting was attended by 25 to 50 young men from Columbus who would drag along a 12-pound cannon they would fire. The Columbus Brass Band would be in attendance as well. Speeches were held most nights on the courthouse steps, inciting voters to take action and protect their interests. The local paper ran many articles, editorials, and campaign reviews that described black candidates and Republican voters as black brutes and worse than carpetbaggers, and plotting to endanger the virtue of every white woman in the county. The editor used the paper to fan the flames, to influence the upcoming election with hyperbole and unfair racial caricatures, a common practice of the time. The night before the election, the Republicans planned to hold a torchlight parade, and Gleed knew that such a political spectacle might attract violence. One columnist in November 13, 1875 issue of the Weekly Mississippi Pilot reported that Gleed advised his supporters to arm themselves only for the purpose of defense in case of attack. By 8 p.m., as Gleed's supporters gathered at Union Academy on the south side of town, a large group of whites gathered at Hatch's drugstore, which sat along the parade route. When a band of drummers and paraders marched past, whites rushed Glead's supporters and smashed the heads of their drums. All was reportedly quiet for the next half hour. Then a fire was reported on the southeast side of the depot. The fire department hitched up the steam engine and raced toward the fire. 5 minutes later, another fire was reported. It was George Curtis's old shed on 4th Avenue South. A third fire was reported at the old Taylor stable west of the courthouse, behind modern-day Zachary's restaurant. A cry falsely went out that the blacks were torching the city. The white crowd raced home for their weapons, and the Columbus riflemen set up pickets at each corner. Squads of armed white men moved down the streets. Mounted men scoured white neighborhoods for black men. The Alabamians mysteriously arrived to help. Blacks fled town and hid. Any African American found on the street was ordered to halt. If they did not, they were either wounded or killed. Squads were then sent to the homes of leading black members of the GOP and told if there were any more fires, they and their families would be held responsible. Scores of white men and boys followed the squads as they descended on Robert Glead's home. He and his wife were not there. The mob broke into his house and destroyed his furniture and belongings. They slashed the breast of each and every one of his wife's clothing. Some in the crowd prepared to light fire to his house, but were stopped by the squad leaders. Glead was nowhere to be found. His friend, white attorney Cornelius Lincoln, hid him in his well under his house on 3rd Avenue South, just blocks away from the chaos and mayhem. His wife and children had already been hidden out of town. That night, 4 men were killed. John Gordon was killed in front of Glead's and Rab's stores on Market Street. I'll read from the newspaper articles. During the night, 4 men were killed and several men and 1 woman were injured. John Gordon was killed on the sidewalk in front of Glead's store, one account says, accidentally. Another that he was aiming a pistol at a passing guard. This is from the Affairs at Columbus, the Weekly Mississippi Pilot, November 1875. In another article, the villainous teachings of Glee had developed into a culmination, and the culmination ended in swift retribution. John Gordon was the first victim. He fell in front of Jack Rab's store. Article title, Incendiarism and Death, Pickens County Herald, November 1875. George Marshall, who was either 9 or 10 years old, was killed in front of Cornelia Benoit's, a widowed mother, her house on Main and 6th. From another article, George Marshall was killed near Mrs. Benoit's residence. It is said he had a gun in his hand and refused to surrender it when commanded. Article title, Affairs at Columbus, the Weekly Mississippi Pilot, November 1875. No explanation is provided on where and how a child would have a gun in his possession, but the Clarion Ledger puts the blame on sheriff's candidate Robert Glead. George Washington, when shot, was aiming at one of the guards and confessed in dying that Glead gave him the gun. Article title, A Night of Terror, the Clarion Ledger, November 1875. Alex Latham, a disabled shoemaker who was reported to have a prosthetic leg, was dragged from his home at 4 a.m. and shot in the street in front of his wife Judy and son Alex Jr. Alex Latham, a crippled shoemaker, it is said, was with a company of 2 or 3 who, in the early part of the trouble, had fired at a squad of soldiers as they passed. At about 4 o'clock in the morning, he was taken from his house and shot. Article title, Affairs at Columbus, the Weekly Mississippi Pilot, November 1875. Sharecropper Essex Green Weaver and his wife headed into their cotton field at daybreak, unaware of the riders in town or the events in town, and were allegedly ordered to halt, but panicked and ran. Essex Green and his wife were reported to have been going to their cotton patch at daybreak in the eastern suburbs of town, and being commanded to halt, started to run when they were fired upon, and Green was killed by a shot through his head and his wife wounded. Article title, Affairs at Columbus, the Weekly Mississippi Pilot, November 1875. Election day was quiet in town. There was understandably a low black voter turnout. Those who did venture to the polls were warned by white liners to vote a straight Democratic ticket. The final vote was tallied, and Democratic candidate Hargrove won by a landslide. According to the Pickens County Herald, We hope the colored people have at last found that incendiary teaching must and will always end in their being the sufferers. Incendiarism and Death, November 1875. The next day, Robert Gleed was on his way to Paris, Texas, with his wife and children, running to escape certain lynching in his adopted hometown of Columbus. Abandoning his properties and businesses, he fled with the clothes on his back to start over. Gleed left behind his general store, more than 295 acres of tillable farmland, 3 city lots, his businesses, and his home.